everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the second breakout session. My name's Erin Bloomklotz, and I'm an Oregon licensed real estate broker with Living Room Realty. I'm also, oh, that's right, it moved, so now you There we go. There we are. I also have some special designations. I'm an Earth Advantage broker, and I'm an ADU specialist, which means that I have additional education and basic regulations for ADU development in the city of Portland. And I have this because my partner Dulcinea and I were seeing a trend that people wanted more flexible living. And as you've been hearing throughout the day today, people want to use ADUs for all different kinds of things. And we found that we have clients who want to buy and sell and evaluate their homes for ADU purposes. Our panelists today are all doing the research that informs exactly what I'm doing on the ground when I help people buy and sell and evaluate their property. So let's meet our three panelists. Our first one is Peter Holzman, who's based here at Portland State, where he is a senior economist at the Northwest Economic Research Center. His past research work includes analysis of Portland's housing prices, deconstruction policy, and the impact of Oregon's minimum wage law. He's also responsible for forecasting population, employment, income, and housing. And he received his master's in economics from Portland State, and he teaches introductory economics courses here. Our second speaker is Matthew Gebhardt, who is an assistant professor of urban studies and planning and real estate development at Portland State. He teaches planning process and ethics, real estate development, housing and redevelopment design. And his background is in planning and economics, and he has a PhD from Columbia University. And then finally, we have Jake Wegman, who spoke earlier today. He's an assistant professor in the Community and Regional Planning program at the University of Texas, Austin. And his research focuses on affordable housing issues in cities. He did his PhD work at Cal Berkeley, and prior to that, he managed projects for for-profit and nonprofit affordable housing developers in Denver and San Francisco. So we're going to start with Peter.
Awesome. Clicker. Perfect. Hi. Thanks for the nice introduction. So I'm an economist. As you've probably realized, I'm not necessarily a specialist in ADUs, so you're going to have to forgive me if I make any mistakes about terminology or anything along those lines. And also, as is my nature as an economist, my job is to be skeptical of things. And so as we're looking into what ADUs can do for affordability, I'm going to be raising lots of potential problems that they may not be good for affordability, and then hopefully will be answered when we actually do the research. That doesn't mean I don't believe or I'm not a true believer or anything like that. It just means that it's my job to take the devil's advocate side of everything. And so a little bit of background into the research project. We're doing a survey of all ADU owners and occupants. And this will tell us a bunch of things about the types of people who are owning them, their income levels, and all of that. Matthew's going to have more about that afterwards. Once we get the survey results all finalized, my job is to research or to use that information and basically determine if ADUs are good for affordability. And you may ask, why is it such a big deal? Well, if you're not from Portland, affordability is a huge deal here. We've had really fast growth, really high immigration rates, really high employment growth, good, decent wage growth on the average level. And all these sorts of good things tend to bring in the bad thing of affordability issues. Portland City Council declared a housing emergency in 2015. The mayor also declared a housing affordability crisis or a housing crisis. And there's been many policies adopted or at least discussed, including inclusionary zoning, which if you don't know is setting aside a certain number of apartments for affordable housing. Landlord restrictions and basically having the landlord pay for any moving fees or restricting their right to get rid of tenants without giving them weeks notice and things along those lines. And there's been whispers of rent control. And so when ADUs have become such a hot topic here, the natural question is, what can they do to help with affordability? This is a graph that my research center puts in a lot of their stuff. I put in a lot of stuff because I'm a shameless self-promoter and I made it. And what it tells you is, well, the reason we created it was to look at if Portland was in a housing bubble, right? With how fast house prices were growing, they were growing fastest in the nation for a couple of years. People thought, if this is the same thing that was happening before. And so we came up with this fundamental HPI index, which tracks it with just the things that should drive house price growth. And you compare it with what's actually happening to the real Case-Shiller HPI, and you can get the giant bubble we had. And so when we show this, a lot of people naturally look at this, the endpoint now. They're saying, well, it's a little bit red, so that means we have an affordability issue. And that is actually not completely unrelated. And these are average statistics. And you can't look at a problem like affordability by looking at averages, because it's really about the distribution of incomes and the distribution of housing prices. You can imagine a situation where there's a bunch of really rich people and a few really poor people, and the poor people can't afford their homes, and the averages work out fine. So remember that housing and affordability, we're going to have to be looking at both, mainly the distribution of incomes and house prices. One of the tricky things with house prices is there's the argument that it bleeds down or trickles down. This is not trickle-down economics, but it kind of is. In the sense that if you build an expensive home, then if they can't sell it to anyone, someone in the tier below is going to eventually move up, and then it's going to trickle down and houses are going to become more affordable. This takes a lot of time, and it's not something we've necessarily seen. In terms of what has caused the rising house prices in Portland, it's really been population growth, rising incomes, and low inventories. Now, the population growth one's interesting, because if you don't know of our weird land use laws, we have an urban growth boundary and also height restrictions on a lot of our apartment complexes. This means that we're basically in a locked-in section, and the more people you add in, the more expensive houses are going to be. Now, rising incomes, that makes sense. The more money people have, the more money they have to spend on homes, and the nicer homes they're going to buy. Low inventories, lower supply, high demand, rising prices. Economics 101. What do ADUs have to do with any of this? Well, really, those arrows are supposed to be up here. Really, let's skip that. Rising incomes and low inventories. ADUs can help with incomes in the sense that people with ADUs who own them can then rent them out and make additional income, which in theory helps with income. Low inventories, the more ADUs there are, that increases density. That helps with the low inventory problem. And so what we're doing is we're going to use the survey data that Matthew is going to soon talk about and compare the price per square foot of ADUs to the price per square foot of other single-family homes of similar sizes, small single-family homes in the neighborhood. And then we're also going to look at the occupants and the owners and compare their incomes to the neighborhood's incomes to make sense tasks. And it gets at more at the distribution as opposed to the averages. And so we have a couple questions, and this is the skeptical side of me. And you want to know how prevalent the usage of short-term rentals is, the Airbnbs. And DEQ did a study back in 2013, and they interviewed the Portland Airbnb people, or the Portland ADU people, and about 5% of ADU owners rented them out to Airbnb or other short-term rental places. This is probably a lot higher. And I guarantee you that Matthew is going to tell you it's a lot higher, because I saw the slide. And so is that really helping with affordability? And Airbnb's point of view, they've actually released statements on this, is that, well, yes, it does, because they now have additional income. They can pay for things. Their income's risen, the house prices stay the same. They can pay for it better. That increases affordability. I don't know, and again, skeptical side of me speaking, if the type of person that can afford to build certain types of ADUs is the type of person that needs additional income. Because, and it depends. There's the type of person that can like separate out a house or separate out a room, add in a little kitchen. That might be the single mom who's struggling to get by. The Airbnb pushes as their like affordability guideline.
Did you do that in your survey? Was there a single mom like owns an ADU?
We haven't done all the crosstabs, but yes, we can get it close to that.
My concern is there wouldn't actually be one that, because of the 70, the two double income and the people that are primarily building are people that are higher, middle, or higher income.
I agree. But that's a different, I wouldn't say I disagree. I will wait until the data tells me, which I think you're probably right. And so the other way of thinking about this is if tiny homes are such a good investment, in terms of renting them out, they can't really be affordable in some senses. So people who are going into it as good investments, they're not doing it for affordability reasons. And the reason that they're getting such a good return is because by its nature, it's not affordable. Next question is neighborhood effects. And if you look right around here, this is the hip part of Portland. As an economist, I'm not invited over there much, but so I can't really speak to it, but it does. There's a certain reason why it's so hot. There's lots of microbreweries, and it's a sort of kind of Portlandia culture that brings about ADUs. Or the tiny homes and that sort of thing. And so there's a multifaceted question here. If the reason why ADUs are being built in that area is just because it's cool, can we necessarily extrapolate that to poorer areas? And one of the big problems with that is all the barriers that I'm sure you've talked about with financing and that sort of thing with ADUs. Is that prohibiting it to an area with really high income or house price equity growth, where the price of their homes has really risen, so they have a lot of equity, so they can get the financing. They tend to be a little bit wealthier. They build the nice, affordable unit, all that sort of thing. Is that what's going on here, or can we really get it into like further down and further out into the Gresham area? Lastly, and I've been again overly a little bit skeptical. But so how can ADUs help? And one thing that I'm very optimistic about, and it's very hard to argue with, is that they increase density. If you can turn a single family residence into that now has two residences, just by changing some law or adding an ADU or something along those lines, then you've naturally increased the household growth. And this is the total inventories in Portland since prior to the Great Recession. And this right here, this is when we were the pre-crisis low. That's when we were in the midst of the bubble, when everyone was flipping homes. You couldn't buy a house fast enough. Prices were skyrocketing. We're still we've fallen so far, we're actually below that. And that is one of my biggest concerns as an economist with the fast house price growth is where's the building? If we can get ADUs in, I think I've heard that there's capacity for 200,000 plus. That is a huge amount of homes. I think that's definitely the upper end of that spectrum, considering that we're calling for 200,000 new households in the next 10 years. So theoretically, you could fill every new household with an ADU. I don't think it's quite that much capacity, especially with the other things that we've talked about. But this is the reason to be optimistic about ADUs and affordability. Unless, of course, I'm wrong about, and no one's using Airbnbs and everyone who's poor, but I'm probably not wrong. So that's my talk, and thank you.
All right, I lot of pressure here because I hear that Robert and others have been talking up this ADU survey and the results. So I will try to give you a little bit about some of the interesting things that we've been learning about how accessory dwelling units are being financed, designed, built, and used in Portland. So to start out with the kind of background to why we chose to do this. So this is part of a larger project that is being run by the Institute for Sustainable Solutions at PSU called the Small Backyard Homes Project. The idea is to look at all of the different aspects of ADUs. So again, how they're financed, how they're designed, where they're being built, the regulatory aspects of it, who's living in them, and the idea is to try and figure out ways to scale up the production and to kind of guide the use of them. So where this fits was we had a lot of anecdotal evidence from people who had built ADUs in the past or from experts who were involved in financing or design, but we wanted to confirm these stories. We wanted to get a better picture of whether or not what we were hearing actually did fit with the kind of general use of ADUs around the cities. This was also to follow up on the 2013 ADU survey that was done by the Department of Environmental Quality, and to focus in on some of the aspects that they didn't really get to, particularly talking to the tenants of ADUs, so the people who were actually occupying them, which was not a component of that survey, as well as digging a little bit more deeply into the kind of the actual rental incomes and some of the parts that then will feed into future work. So the overall goals were to learn about those ADUs, again, the financing and building of them, the types of amenities that were parts of them, and how owners and tenants viewed those amenities and the ADUs themselves, trying to figure out whether there were barriers to the construction and use of those ADUs, and identifying different aspects around the planning, financing, and managing of them. This was a survey that went out to people who had applied for and received permits to build accessory dwelling units in Portland. So we sent these to the people who had already completed ADUs. We also sent them to the addresses of the ADUs themselves, trying to get to, again, the occupants of those ADUs, and then also to those who had applied for permits and received them, but didn't get a final permit yet, a certificate of occupancy for it. So we were trying to then get at a group that, again, wasn't really covered before, of people who had tried to build ADUs and either were somewhere in the process or perhaps had given up on completing them, and trying to figure out what kind of barriers perhaps they ran into that led to them choosing not to follow through with that. And again, I really want to thank ISS for all the support that they gave us for being able to actually run this. So doing the mailings, providing incentives, as well as resources for analyzing it. Okay, so I mentioned there were essentially 4 different groups that we were trying to reach. And I'm going to focus on the owners of ADUs, those who were owners and lived in the ADUs, and those who live in the ADUs. So right now I'm not talking very much about the people who didn't actually finish an ADU yet, although that is in the data set. So this is the group that we're looking at here. I don't actually have the response rates here, but it's looking at something about a little over 20% in terms of owners of ADUs. A bit lower for live-in ADUs, although with the number that might actually be used for short-term rentals, we might actually be fairly high there, and then also those owners. And this is information that came in on the 31st of last month, so it's only a few days old. So we've been starting to wade through it very recently. So I tried to pick out some interesting aspects of the use of the ADUs to share here, and then there's a lot more information that we can talk about either in Q&A or will be coming out subsequently. Okay, so again, trying to think about some of the bigger questions of who's building these ADUs, who's living in them, and trying to confirm, again, some of those stories that we've been hearing. Looking at first owners of ADUs, live in ADU, and the owner who lives in the ADU, this is age. And basically what we're finding is the owners of ADUs tend to be in the 35 to 54 range, and whereas those who are living in the ADUs are much younger. And overall, those who are owners that live in ADUs tend to be on the older side. And again, this in many ways confirms the stories that we're hearing, that the people who are building them are those who are sort of in the prime of their careers, who have some equity built up in their homes and can do that. Those who are living in it, or maybe those who were still in the rental market, not entering ownership yet, were looking for relatively affordable ways to get access to certain neighborhoods. And those who were owners and living in them maybe were actually retirees. Again, we're doing some of the digging into that data, and that seems to be the trends that we're seeing. This was a particularly interesting one around incomes here. So that owners of ADU, the incomes were very, very high. So almost 50% were over on 100,000 household income, and this is leaving out the actual income that might have been generated by the ADUs. So very high earners building them, living in ADUs on the other side of the income spectrum, so below 60,000. Owners who live in ADUs, it's sort of more of a mixed story, but what you're seeing here is actually there's quite a few people who are retirees and on fixed income, so we're seeing a little bit lower trend there, although also still quite a few who are on the higher end of the income spectrum. Again, people who are kind of in the prime of their earning career are the ones who are building these ADUs. A little bit more about the types of ADUs. So this gives you a breakdown of, this actually should be basement or attic renovations. The largest number were detached new structures. And yeah, not too much more to say about that. Some of the uses. So looking at the current use of ADUs. Talking about the numbers in terms of short-term rentals. What we're finding, and this is putting together both the owners who are occupying it as well as the owners themselves. Of all of those, it's about 30% are used for short-term rentals. So that is the current single use of the ADU. Some are used for extra rooms and workspace. That's the primary residence, and primary residence for those who are not owners. So a lot of these are either family members who are living in it or rental. Oops.
Did you run into any LLCs or private equity people that owned essentially the home in the ADU, or was it all actual individuals?
So I don't actually know at the moment, so we need to dig into that a little bit more. So I thought this was particularly interesting when we started to break down who were in this group here, the primary residence not owner. A lot were family members or friends, but a fair amount were people that they didn't know. So this is going out on the private rental market and just making it available, people then who are renting it. So that was quite interesting. We perhaps weren't sure what we were going to get in terms of those numbers. Prior uses, this is a little bit more confusing because people were able to pick multiple options here. And there's quite a bit of overlap in some of these. So a lot of the people who picked short-term rental also had it for extra rooms. So saying, oh, we had family come live here a couple months out of the year, something like that. There was extra room for those families. And when they weren't here, we were using it as short-term rentals.
What do you mean prior use? You mean the
So this is,
previous use?
yeah, previous use of the ADU. So if it was constructed, 4 years ago, sometime in that 4 years up until the current point at which they received the survey, how was the ADU used? So this is something, again, we'll have to dig quite a bit more into, matching those up, current uses and prior uses, and there's some overlap in these. And then we also asked people how they plan to use the ADUs in the future. And quite a few still thought that they'd be using this as short-term rentals, but quite a bit more on the primary residences for long-term rentals or for family or friends. So some interest in kind of shifting that use over. couple more little slides here, one having to do with those short-term rentals. So this is trying to get at those people who said they were using it as a short-term rental. Was that the primary use of it, or was the primary use something else and they occasionally would put it on there to make a little extra income? So this group right here were mostly people who that was their primary use of it, was of short-term rentals. And so that's just under 60% of that group.
How does the more than 90-day, almost touching 60%, align with your 29% saying a short-term rental?
So this is about 58% of that 29%. So last few slides here. So we also asked people who were going into or living in ADUs where else they might be living. So what type of residences is this, replacing? For those who were owners who lived in the ADU, not surprisingly, they basically said that they would have been living in the main house if they weren't living in the ADU. On the other hand, those who were living in the ADUs and renting it tended to say they'd be living in apartments otherwise. So this gets at the question of, well, especially if these are mostly in single-family neighborhoods, it's where apartments aren't necessarily an option. It may be a shifting where people are actually able to live within the city. Last few slides here, reasons that people chose to live in an ADU, and again, they could choose multiple of these, so there's some overlap here. But basically, those who were owners who lived in the ADU said that they chose to do that because they wanted to downsize, so they were moving out of their main home into the ADU, and because they wanted so it's cost of living, so they were making, they could make more in rental from the main home, and it was a lower cost of living for them overall. A lot of them also had indicated a relationship to the main house owners, so probably family or friends living in there, and some desire to stay in the neighborhood. For those who were simply living in the ADU, it was cost of living and desire to get access to that neighborhood. So again, in some ways confirming some of the stories that we're hearing. Last few slides here, we asked about cars because this is one of the topics that comes up regularly. Do people who live in ADUs have fewer cars? Where are they parking them? Those who live in ADUs do tend to have fewer cars than those who are living in the main homes or even the owners who live in the ADUs. Where do they park them, though? They tend to park them on the street versus those who are the owners tend to park them on site. So there's fewer of them, but they do tend to park them on the streets. And the last one here, neighborhood tenure. So how long were people actually living in the neighborhoods? So owners of ADUs primarily had lived in the neighborhoods for a very long time. Similarly, owners who live in the ADUs, at least 6 years or more, whereas those who are living in the ADUs but don't own them tend to be newer entrants into those neighborhoods. And this, again, is not particularly surprising because a lot of the ADUs that we see are fairly recently built. So if you weren't somebody who owned the home and was building it, then.
What was the geographic spread of the survey?
So this was Portland city limits, yes.
Portland, and can you give a breakdown of which neighborhoods the ADUs? Did you scatter plot the neighborhoods?
We have that. I don't have it in the slides. I think was the one that you showed, the Peters, the slide earlier.
Location of ADU.
Oh, yeah.
A lot on the inner east side.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, yes. So those are all the slides I have for right now, and I'm happy to answer more questions.
Well, a lot of you heard me speak earlier, so I'm certainly not going to give you another PowerPoint. And I will try to be pretty brief just so that we can get to discussion. But my charge for this panel was to answer the question, are ADUs here to stay or are they niche development? And if you heard my talk this morning, my answers are ADUs here to stay? Yes. Or are they niche development? Yes. Although hopefully a lot of great ideas are percolating here to try to make them something more than niche development. But I think the honest answer is that yes, they are still niche development for the time being. But perhaps more intriguing are the kind of the two sub-questions I got from that. So what can we learn from a broader geographic perspective? And then if we eliminate regulatory barriers, what do we see happening? So these are the two things I want to just dig into a little bit here. So the first one, what can we learn from a broader geographic perspective? Now, I'm struggling to remember which one of the speakers did this morning, but there's this great slide kind of showing the kinds of places that seem to be our ADU capitals in, circa the year 2017. Santa Cruz, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, BC. Austin a little bit, I got to give some props to where I live. But it is a particular type of place that where ADUs seem to be really succeeding right now. These are culturally liberal places. These are progressive places. These are places with highly educated populations. They're West Coast kinds of places. They're supply-constrained, hot housing markets. And they're green conscious. And a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are seen from the point of view of the United States as a whole, on the more homogeneous, less diverse side. So I guess the question is, so again, what does bringing in a broader geography kind of add to this? And I guess I would start with, if you heard my morning talk, I talked about this kind of false dawn of ADUs that we had in the 80s, where there was a moment of great excitement about them that really in the end kind of fizzled in a lot of ways. But I think the reasons were sound. There was a lot of concern about, it was less about green infill and less about affordable housing crises, and it was more about concerns concerning aging of the population and how will elderly homeowners stay in their houses. It was the places that were being thought about were much more the suburbs, really, than the central cities, and it was all around the country. It definitely was not a West Coast-centered movement. In fact, a lot of the action was in the Northeast, a lot in Long Island, suburbs of Boston, and similar places. All those places are still there, and aging the population is even more of an issue now, 25, 30 years later. Those issues haven't gone away at all. So I think to the extent that we can kind of fold that back into this awesome West Coast story, hot housing market story that we have here, I think that'll strengthen the ADU movement. I think another piece that needs to be added to the story, again, I talked about it this morning, but this is what I call the LA informal housing story. I hope I made it clear, but when I showed that graph that Jason Neville had put together, this incredible spike in ADU permits in the city of Los Angeles, in large part thanks to the incredible efforts of Denise Pinkton and all that she and her organization did to lobby California to change their laws. I may not have made it clear, but Jason's analysis showed the big majority of those permits, that's not new ADUs being built. That's existing ADUs being retroactively permitted or given amnesty or whatever terms you want to use. So I think this is this kind of big sleeping giant that's out there, absolutely in LA, absolutely in the Bay Area, but probably in lots of other parts of the country too. But not so easy to see. And then I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I think maybe a sleeper geography for ADUs might surprisingly, it could be possibly Rust Belt America, which I know we're not thinking about a ton today, but the thing about it is even Detroit and Cleveland and St. Louis, of course they have vast parts of those cities that have high vacancy rates where it just makes no economic sense to build any new housing at all because an existing house costs $20,000. But even in those cities, there are pockets that are intensely booming right now. I remember seeing it's very difficult to rent an apartment in downtown Cleveland now. There's these pockets of, they're very small, but of really intense activity with high opportunity areas, and perhaps ADUs could play a role in increasing equitable access to some of those places within those those regions. So I really do think we have the possibility for a truly national conversation about this topic. And maybe that's even more so as we kind of get into some of the federal policies that could really make this take off, like some of the disaster recovery angle that was explained so elegantly by Harriet Tregoning. So okay, so that's the first sub-question. Then the other one, I like this one. What if we eliminate regulatory barriers? Kind of, where is this going to lead us? Well, of course, our economist is the real expert on this here. But my sense is, if we just kind of look at Vancouver as sort of what the near future might look like, if we go the full Vancouver, meaning if Portland and other places say, hey, we're not just going to let you build one ADU, we're going to let you do 2 on every single family lot, then I think what we're really talking about is kind of the stealth reinvention of single family housing. And as I see it, if you listen to Jake Fry's statistics, the average median or average single family house in Vancouver, 2 million? Are you kidding me? I mean, I think Vancouver has effectively given up on anything resembling traditional single family detached ownership for normal people like you and me, right? I think in ADU's policy might be helping alleviate that, but it could also, I think we have to be prepared for the possibility that ADUs are also kind of pumping up that housing market too. In other words, baked into those prices now is probably the expectation that if you don't have an ADU already, then the person who buys it, boom, they're going to put 2 of them on that lot.
Well, and Patrick talked about it as an asset class,
Mm-hmm.
and he's looking at it exactly the right way. The thing is, if you attach an income-producing asset class to a piece of real estate, then you can, and we get good at appraising it and amortizing it and looking at the income stream, then essentially you are, at some point in time, it's essentially going to raise property value as well.
Yep. So I think we got to talk about that. I mean, really, one way to think of it is if you think of some cities in the United States, especially in the Midwest and the East, if you go to Boston or Chicago, a big common housing form in Boston, 3-decker houses, and Chicago, 3 flats. The traditional model was one household would own the whole building and live in one of the flats, and the other 2 would be occupied maybe by extended family, maybe by rented to strangers, and that's maybe kind of what we're headed towards with ADUs, but we're kind of doing it more in an incremental manner rather than you put up one building all at once that has 3 units. And I think that will be great in a lot of ways. I think it'll certainly expand rental housing options, and I think some of the survey evidence we just saw shows that. But on its own, it's not going to expand access to home ownership, I don't think. I think if anything, it might even further restrict it. Does that mean we shouldn't do it? No, I don't think so. But especially if we don't crack this financing nut, then I think we know where this is going. And regarding I just wanted to add one thing to the STR, the short-term rentals conversation, because that could be another thing that could be pumping up the prices that people are willing to pay. In Austin, we're starting to see developers who are putting up housing that it's designed from the beginning to be rented out as STRs. And now, one thing I can add just a little bit to the STR conversation is I did just do a study, just published it, looked at 5 cities. Portland wasn't one of them, but we scraped Airbnb listings from 5 cities and looked at where they were. And they are intensely geographically concentrated in Austin, Chicago, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Boston. Those are the 5 cities we looked at. And all the neighborhoods that you would think of in Portland, inner east side hipster Portland is exactly where I would expect it. I mean, like I said, I didn't analyze Portland. So probably outer east side Portland, I'm guessing, is not going to get a ton of STRs in the future. So at least based on what I've seen so far. So that's just, a little bit of nuance to this discussion, perhaps. So let me just close by talking a little bit about what I ended my talk with this morning. This, should we think about making it easy or possible for single-family homeowners to subdivide their lots? What could that look like? I think there are some intriguing precedents for that. I've never been to Japan. I've barely been to South Korea, but my understanding is the main reason those cities in that part of the world are so dense, it's not because of all the high-rises they have, although they have tons of high-rises. But even in Tokyo, high-rises are in a pretty small area, relatively speaking. But what they do have are vast neighborhoods of very small lot single-family houses on 1,500 square foot, 1,000 square foot, 2,000 square foot lots. And so, but it turns out people there, just like people here, like to own their own little patch of dirt and have their own house on it. It's just they use a whole lot less land in the process than we do. So I don't know, should we think about ways to evolve towards that? I do think we have some precedents in that direction here in the US. Actually, a lot of beach communities are very small lot, small house communities. So Venice Beach in Los Angeles, some of the other beach communities down the coast, some of the beach communities in New York City, like in Far Rockaway, Queens, are like that. So it's not a totally unknown type of development pattern to us in this country. I don't know. I just think it's something worth thinking about, because unlike some of the other ideas we're talking about, that is the one that perhaps could reduce the cost of actual family-friendly homeownership, which is very important to a lot of people in our cities. So I'll stop there. I'm really excited for the discussion.
Questions, right here. Sorry to point.
Sorry, was it me or Tim?
You can go first, and Tim can go second.
So for Matthew and Peter, I'm hoping that what you learned from the research information, the data indicates a little bit about the prospect for very high rapid returns on short-term rentals or creating housing stock that would not exist at all. And that's what I've heard anecdotally is people say, I can get a pile of money, but I can do it for a few years and buy down my debt. So these are people who wouldn't have enough money to do it without that. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's an interesting question. The second thing is, and so that also requires a survey over time to see whether people get tired of folding towels and doing laundry, which I know happens with people. It's also true that there are short-term rentals that are not ADUs anyway, that are in homes. So that's, I think, an important question about the market. The second thing is, for lower income areas that don't have short-term rental opportunity, you'd still be interested to know whether or not, as we were discussing this earlier today, maybe $300 a month is critical for someone in Outer East Side or in Aloha on the West Side. And then if there's a model for them to even get that amount of money, that'd be great. And then the rent for that might be considerably less than the hipsters. So for me, when I think about it, I think, well, the hardest place to get housing right now in the places that are hip. But now we have a way of getting it there. So now the next question is, what about the rest of the city? And maybe it doesn't require as much incentive to do that. But maybe there's some hints at answers already, or is that yet to come?
Yeah, no, so we did ask questions specifically to the respondents who said that they were using or had used their ADUs for short-term rentals, about why they're doing it. Overwhelmingly it was for flexibility and because it generates more income than long-term rental. So 35% said generates more income, 40% said flexibility to use it. We did ask how long they thought it would take to pay back, how long they had figured to pay back the cost of the ADU, but we have to kind of break that down in terms of short-term rental versus those who are looking at it as long-term rental, and we haven't had a chance to do that yet. But that is one of the questions that we're looking at, is whether or not people are, because we've heard that same story, that people are planning to use it for short-term rental for a while, to pay back the cost of constructing it, and then maybe look at using it as something else. So we have all that data, we just haven't had a chance to kind of piece it all together yet. I will say that 43% said that the biggest drawback they found for using their ADU for short-term rentals is that it was more work to manage it than long-term rental. So there is a little bit of that to it as well.
Tim?
So, thank you all for great content. It's really good to see the analytical depth you're applying to this. I missed the first 2 minutes, so maybe you defined affordability before I came in, but it seemed like there maybe were some mashup uses of the term affordability, because I think, Jake, you mentioned that, you know, if this is an asset class that goes along with every one of these $2 million homes, then that's maybe presenting a barrier to home ownership. But when I think about affordability, I'm thinking about the occupant of the ADU being able to live in the community at all, not ownership. And I think, Peter, you were talking about the income from the unit and creating the affordability then for the owner of the main house. That's a different kind of affordability than what I think most of us are thinking about is can somebody live in the ADU and afford to be in that town?
I agree. To correct myself, I was saying Airbnb's case for how that's affordable housing, and not necessarily that it doesn't directly apply to our situation. So I agree.
Can I just add a little bit? This really cool piece of research from the 1980s looked at a suburb of Long Island called Babylon, New York. And it was really ahead of its time study. And it was and is a very kind of racially segregated town. And it showed this very striking pattern where white homeowners tended to rent to white tenants. And of course, it's worth noting that ADU rentals are not subject to federal fair housing law. So I think, you know, that's not to pour cold water on ADUs, and I think they help, and I think they're awesome. I just think we have to at least, you know, be cognizant of that and not expect that ADUs, even if they're affordable, even if they're, you know, do all the things that we want them to, that you don't automatically that doesn't automatically even out the racial and social divisions.
Is that in Oregon that they're not subject to fair housing?
No, just nationwide. Now, I mean, cities or states can have their own more stringent fair housing laws that go on top of that, but the minimum federal standard is there's no fair housing under 4 or fewer units. Yeah.
So I was a housing planner in San Rafael, California, and I did these kind of surveys. I did 3 at San Rafael. And we found, similar to your 41% are family members, that ADUs really were for family members in a lot of situations. I don't know whether you asked for income level and the number of people living in the ADU, but we found in San Rafael, 25% were for very low and low income, 50% were at moderate, and the rest were at market rate. So I don't know. But what we found in Marin County, where San Rafael is, there are some jurisdictions where the ADUs go for quite a lot more money than what we found in ours. So I'm curious whether you saw any differential in the type of neighborhoods. Some jurisdictions where they go for only high income, those planners tended to say, these are not a good idea. In other jurisdictions where there was more family membership and lower income were renting, they were saying, this is a good idea. So have you had any chance to sort that out with your income responses?
So we're again, sort of, we have the data to do that. But
Come back in a month.
but here's what I would say about that we did find that there were quite a few ADUs that were family members or friends, and generally looking through the data, they appear to be below market rate there. We did ask ADU owners to self-report whether it was below market rate or at market rate, and 43% said that they were renting below market rate, and just over 50% at or above market rate. But then we also asked for what they were actually renting them at to try to confirm those perceptions. And so we do have the geographic distribution, and we'll be looking into that. But yeah, it does appear that at least for family members and friends, there is a discounted, so that it is more affordable. But then that, based on the responses, that would suggest that if you're not renting to family members or friends, it's not something that is below market rate or above market rate in terms of the rental.
Right here?
Hi, thanks. Piggybacking a little on this issue of affordability. So I'm managing the ADU implementation program in San Francisco, and my colleagues and I are kind of hypothesizing a little on this idea of unit quality and the pricing of the units. So I've seen hundreds of these permits now. There's quite a range in what the units quality. So if you look at floor to ceiling height, the amount of glazing, what the units are facing onto as far as open space, whether they're in kind of a non-technical term crappy basement versus kind of a cottage that's being converted. So there's a really huge distinction between kind of what the quality of that unit might be, and regardless neighborhood as well. But I'm wondering if there's any way to assign some kind of criteria, working with like kind of real estate consultants, and what might be like the criteria to kind of think through what might make the unit better, and think through how those units get priced from the real estate market. I don't know if you guys have looked at that, or if we're just hypothesizing from kind of a planning perspective, but wondering if you guys have thought through that at all, with kind of that affordability numbers or unit pricing numbers.
You're absolutely right, and it's a problem that we're going to have in our research, is that we're basically just looking at square foot. We're not controlling for brand new wood, if it's a newly built separate ADU, anything like that. And so an 800 square foot nice new home is going to be treated exactly the same as someone's basement. At the same time, it's very hard to deal with that, in the sense that we have to, just even finding out who has ADUs in real estate data, it's not like it's a button that you click and sort by ADUs. It's not that widely used. Now we have found them, and so yes.
Come with questions.
We some of them, and so I guess we could manually go through and see them, but I think right now we're limited to just doing it by square foot. Though you're absolutely right.
One bit of data that we do have, though, are we asked about amenities for the site, so shared amenities. And some amenities for the units. So we have a little bit of that data, but the kind of fixture quality, the finishes quality, those sorts of things, we don't have that information.
You have a cost per square foot for construction?
We can get the cost per square foot for construction, so that may give us hints about
Do you have the address?
We don't have, no, unfortunately, because of the confidentiality, we have to separate out the addresses. So we have the kind of larger geographies, but linking it to the actual addresses is, yeah.
And the tough thing with Zillow is that they only update it when the house goes for sale, and so there's not going to be any new information on Zillow or anything like that.
Right here?
It seems like one of the interesting macroeconomic impacts ADUs could have, if they are able to get to scale, is creating a different kind of development pressure in the marketplace, where now you have traditional multifamily developers who will tend to pull back on development when they start to see rent softening, and will sit on property, whereas from an individual homeowner's perspective, they have the incentive to build anyway, as long as the economics of building will still be greater than the cost. I wanted to see, I think there's some evidence of that from Vancouver, where owning a home is unaffordable, but the rents have actually stayed a little bit more moderate than in the U.S. I just wanted to get feedback from you all on whether you've seen anything like that in the data you've seen.
I have not. Well, generally rents have softened in Portland regardless, and that is, I guess, more towards your multifamily. They built a lot of multifamily homes, and now finally things are, inventories for at least that section of the market's catching up a little bit. I'm not quite sure that I would say both developers and homeowners are going to respond to the same price signals. So if there's a need for inventory, a homeowner is going to build an ADU and rent it out. If they're not going to make the money off of it, they're not going to build it.
Well, I guess I'm thinking because the homeowner already owns the land, whereas in many cases the developer would have to acquire the land as a precondition, that if they already have the land, they might as well be making money off of it, might be the homeowner's economic perspective.
Well, I mean, I don't have the evidence, but I think what you articulated is a good part of the argument for being pro ADU because multifamily development, it's big chunks of capital being deployed all at once. It takes, under the best of circumstances, it takes years to come to fruition. And so multifamily development, especially in a really, regulatorily onerous city like, sorry, San Francisco, I have to pick on you, right? But, there, the
You're number one.
multifamily development, it doesn't start until pretty deep into the real estate cycle, and then it just falls off a cliff when the market goes down. And so sometimes San Francisco, it's like there's this window of just a few years in an economic boom when any housing is being built at all. So if we have this type of housing that can actually sort of keep plodding along a little bit during a recession, because homeowners have, the timing might be just driven by what's going on in their lives, less than by market cycles. I think it can kind of even out our housing supply.
I would just add one thing, some interesting responses to the barriers question, to when people ran into problems. The aspects of construction came up regularly, in particular access to subcontractors, that a lot of the subcontractors were also working on multifamily sites and things like that paid quite a bit more, and so they weren't showing up, so it was taking longer or costing more to do that. So perhaps actually in some of the down cycle, it might become more affordable to actually do the construction for
and not lose our whole construction workforce during the recession.
So.
Right here?
I have a question about utilities. Specifically, do you guys ask how many people develop their ADU on a separate meter?
Yes, we did ask that. That is data that I haven't dug very deeply into yet. But we asked the numbers on that, and as well what other shared utilities they had. I will find that, and I'll actually try to give you the exact answer.
So we have about 3 minutes left, so a couple more questions right back here.
Yeah, so I guess so far most of the data that you tend to see when it comes to ADUs is around a few key cities where it's this Goldilocks zone of affordability issues and the right kind of lots. And you mentioned that, Jake, that St. Louis, Cleveland, and Detroit might be kind of these kind of sleeper geos that are about to come online. Like, what do you think it's going to take for cities that aren't experiencing housing crisis to start being more proactive about this and make it more of a national conversation and not something that just happens in few markets, where I think from the outside, some people would look at Portland and say to themselves, like, housing crisis, like, what are you talking about?
I guess I think it's the, we do have this kind of deepening national conversation going on about social equity and racial disparities. I think if it's framed in those terms, just, Chicago, right? That's neither a red hot, supply constrained market like here, nor is it a true Rust Belt market like Detroit. It's something in between. I've heard it described as like San Francisco pasted on to Detroit, right? So part of Chicago is prices are high, vacancies are low, construction is shooting up, and then you go a few miles away and cross a historic racial boundary, and there's urban prairie, right? So I think if it's framed as, hey, ADUs are one thing that we can do to give more people access to parts of the city that have traditionally been closed off to low-income people, to African Americans. I think that's maybe at least one way of generating some excitement around the possibility.
Just on the utilities, about 65% had separate meters.
Entirely separate?
That's at least that's what they indicated.
Back here? Yes, you.
I actually have two questions. One, a lot of the conversation is focusing on conversion units and cottage homes, and I just wonder if there's a lot of research going on with carve-out units and really going back to a multi-generational housing model, which is, the common housing model in this country. And LilyPad, my nonprofit, actually sponsored one of the other California laws, and in many of the jurisdictions in California, they're allowing for what is referred to as a junior accessory dwelling unit and an ADU on the same property at the same time. So I just wonder, by far, it's the least expensive kind of ADU we can possibly build, bringing down, making it much more affordable because you don't have to pay back so much money because you're taking advantage of what is already conditioned space. So I just wonder what the research is going on with that. And my other question is about the owner occupancy piece. Because I don't know that there's necessarily a lot of research that we were talking earlier about how most of these units are created for multi-generational housing. And I just worry if we are maximizing the rental income, you know, in the single family home and we get rid of the owner occupancy piece, are we really actually increasing the cost of housing in our communities because investors move in? And instead of using the power of the rental market to actually open doors for home ownership for our workforce. And to me, that's a huge opportunity, and in my opinion, a bit of a mistake to not regulate owner occupancy. Yeah.
You want to respond to that? I'm really glad you brought up carve-out units or internal ADUs or whatever you want to call them. And upon reflection, I probably should have really spotlighted that in my talk this morning. But yeah, it gets left off the radar. Just you know, the backyard cottage. It's visually charismatic, right? It's the solar panel. It is to housing what solar panels are to green building, right? I love solar panels, but I mean, like, energy efficiency retrofits are dollar to dollar most of the time, kind of have a bigger impact. And in Austin, we loosened up the rules on detached ADUs, but I think just the low-hanging fruit for us is to make it easy to do the $30,000 units rather than the $150,000 units. And it's a anti-displacement measure. We got to do it. Thanks for bringing that up.
We're out of time. So if you have more questions, I think these guys will be floating around for a little while. Thanks for coming. And enjoy.